There you go.
Michael, Amaya, can you guys hear me?
Hello? No, we can't.
Yep.
And we're sitting right next to each other, so it's just going to be my microphone.
Okay.
And
Can you turn it up?
yeah, I can turn it.
There we go.
Can you still hear me?
We can hear you, yeah.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to share my screen so that we can look at various things.
Okay.
Oops. Ooh.
So,
Yeah. That way we can look at specific questions if you had them from wherever.
Sweet.
All right, so we have the exam this week covering chapters 4 and 7. Was there a specific thing bothering you guys that you wanted to start with? Or?
I think I had more questions on chapter 7 than chapter 4.
Yeah.
But chapter 4 also is like 2 weeks ago now. So maybe just a quick review would be
Okay.
helpful.
Okay. Well, we can start with 7 then. Was there maybe a specific question you wanted to look at from either the homework or?
I know I was emailing you because I had a few questions on chapter 7's homework.
Yeah.
But I do think that it would be helpful to go over, I want to say it was product margin
Okay.
and the managerial overhead. And I did struggle with that last question specifically.
Okay.
And did you have any questions on homework?
No, my biggest thing was just, like she said, it was the product margin. I have the formula for that, so I know how to calculate that.
Okay.
But then on requirement 3 for question number 3, we had some trouble filling in some of those numbers.
Okay.
So
yeah, let's just kind of jump in there then. So product margin, you mentioned you have the formula. Basically, all it's trying to tell us really is how profitable is a particular product when we allocate, the costs we need to allocate to it. So for our purposes, we're considering anything that's direct materials, direct labor, or any of our manufacturing overhead. So I know in this particular problem, we had these 2 different products, this B300 and T500, and they gave us, as I'm kind of looking at it, the direct materials and direct labor amounts. So the only things we had to do there in terms of a per unit amount, if we wanted it, would be to divide by the number of units we produced. But really, we could kind of leave it at this total to find the total product margin. So really, we're kind of starting with, so I'll just kind of sketch out the B and the T here. So we're always starting with sales, right? How much did these things contribute toward potentially the bottom line? And if I remember right, oh yeah, so we had to do a little bit of math here. We sold 60,200 units of the B300 at $21, and we sold 12,800 units of the T500 at $39. And as I'm saying this, I'm realizing your numbers might have been slightly different.
Yeah.
Because it has that sort of number randomization, but you kind of see what's happening there, and we can always stop. So from that, we know we can take off direct materials and direct labor without any heavy math here. So the B300 had labor of 400,000 and change, or excuse me, materials had labor of 120,800, and the T had kind of this here. So then that leaves the hard part, manufacturing overhead. So the first part of this asked us to do product margin under our traditional costing system. And so in our traditional costing system, it told us in our setup here, I'll kind of drag my cursor over it, that normally we would allocate overhead using a single plant-wide overhead rate and direct labor dollars as our allocation base. So let's figure out first what our plant-wide rate would have been. And if we think back to chapter 3, I guess is where we really focused on that. Plant-wide overhead rates are determined by taking our total estimated overhead divided by our total estimated activity or volume, okay, whatever our base is. In this case, they told us that was direct labor dollars, so we'll be focusing on this 163,000 and change for total direct labor. So my plant-wide rate then would be my total estimated overhead is 497,000 and change, divided by that total estimated direct labor dollars, 163,500. Okay. So that amount 304, that's currency, right, is the plant-wide overhead rate. So that's $3.04 per direct labor dollar. Put that in caps just so we're kind of careful how we apply that in a minute. Okay. So what that's telling me is based on my estimates of what I expect to incur or what I actually incurred in overhead for the whole period, for every dollar I spend in direct labor on a particular product, I want to allocate or apply or assign $3.04 in overhead to that same product. And again, this is on our traditional costing system, one rate for everything. So in that scenario, then I would come here to the B300 and say, well, my rate is $3.04 for every direct labor dollar. And the B300 had or incurred 120,800 in direct labor costs for this period. Okay, so 304 per direct labor dollar times the total labor dollars incurred by the B300 or by the production of the B300 would give me my overhead applied 367 and change. So then we do the same thing for the T500. Same rate, $3.04 per labor dollar. And the T500 here incurred much less, 42,000, 700 in direct labor costs. So I'd apply 129 and change to the T500. And one nice thing about what we're doing here is if I add these up, whoops, with rounding, I should get this total amount of manufacturing overhead from my total for the period.
Right.
Yeah. Now we're off a few $100 because this is actually, you know, if we push the decimals out, whoops, 304 and some decimals. But I always want to make sure I've accounted for all of that overhead, no matter how many products or divisions or however I'm divvying this stuff up. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay.
The issue I guess we ran into with
we didn't have that.
the third problem was we couldn't figure out how to calculate that.
Right.
Because I actually, through kind of like guessing and kind of looking at patterns, I found out what the percentages were supposed to be on requirement 3, but I couldn't figure out the exact dollar amount. Because what I was doing at that point, I was reverse engineering the problem, and I was able to do everything. So right down there under manufacturing overhead, my percentages that came out to be 74.9 and 25 even.
Okay.
But through that, I tried several different numbers. I knew the biggest issue was the fact that even if I found that predetermined overhead rate, I didn't have all the correct like decimals behind the decimal place.
Right.
It wasn't going to give me the exact answer.
Right. I see what you mean. Yeah. So you were doing those percentages based on,
Yes.
based on just the amount of the total. Okay. I got you. Yep. Okay. Yeah. So we want to make sure we stick with that rate for everybody, just for a couple of those reasons that you mentioned, right? We're not going to have that same granularity if we don't. So we might have slight differences that could kind of compound themselves as we build this out. Okay, so to finish out the product margin here, I guess we've got everything we need. So we would just say then, well, it's our sales minus all the costs we've incurred to produce that product. So for the B3, that comes out at, this 375 and change if we have the same numbers, and the T5 is much less.
So yeah, that makes sense, because that's where I got stuck. I didn't think to use that formula, so I couldn't figure out what my manufacturing overhead was.
Oh, okay.
So once I got to that point, it was like I couldn't fill in the product margin because I was just getting I wasn't finding the right exact numbers for it.
Right. I see what you mean. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, that makes sense now.
Okay. So then we're going to do the same thing now using the ABC system. Mm-hmm. So the nice thing about that, or if nice is the word, this whole part doesn't change, right? Because sales is still the same, direct materials, direct labor, that's all the same. Now we just have to change the way we allocate or apply overhead to these products. Okay. So in our ABC system, rather than having a plant-wide overhead rate, we have these activity rates, right? The helpful part, at least from my perspective, is to think about them being almost one and the same, because we calculate them practically identically. So our activity rates we calculate as the total estimated overhead in that activity. So I'll put in that activity, if I can type, divided by the total estimated activity base. So ostensibly or fundamentally, really that's kind of the same principle as the plant-wide overhead rate, only now we're saying we're just breaking these things down to a more granular level. We're trying to figure out really what's driving the costs for these individual activities rather than what's driving the cost for everything happening in the plant all at once. So in this particular problem we had, we'll do these off to the side. We had this machining activity. We had setups. We had product sustaining. And then we had these org sustaining. We'll talk about those in a second. Or actually, we might as well talk about it now. So org sustaining, we don't allocate anything there. Those are costs, again, that kind of go to the top line. We can't figure out a good way to allocate them to individual products. They don't really apply to individual products. So we'll ignore them from an allocation standpoint. Mm-hmm. So our other ones, though, we need to come up with these activity rates. Mm-hmm. So again, we'll take that total estimated cost in that activity pool divided by the total estimated activity base. Mm-hmm. So machining, we incurred costs of $205,605. So that's what we've assigned to that cost pool. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be for 152,300 total machine hours.
Right.
We want to make sure we're careful there that we don't do two different rates for two different products. Right? We're talking about the rate for that activity, irrespective of how many products we need to assign this to. So if I crunch the number there, that's $1.35. Again, that's per machine hour. Just take note of our allocation base there. Setups, we're allocating on the basis of setup hours in this case. So we had 129,430 in total cost in that cost pool. And that's for a total of 301 setup hours. So that's $430 per setup hour. And then product sustaining, this one's fairly straightforward. Crunch the number quick. 101,600 in product sustaining costs, whatever those are. And we just had these two products. So 50,800 for each product. Excuse me. So now, when we want to determine the overhead applied to each product, we'll do that in the similar way as we did with the plant-wide rate, only now we have to make sure we incorporate all these different activities. Right. So in fact, I'll I'll do this out to the side of here, and then we'll plug back in on the left-hand side. So the B300, for example, here, used up or incurred or was responsible for 90,000 machine hours in that machining pool.
Mm-hmm.
So 90,000 times, oops, let me turn my light on here, times $1.35 per machine hour means we're applying 121.5 to the B300. And then for the T500, that used up 62,300 hours. And times that same activity rate of $1.35. And there's our machining cost for the T500. And again, if we add those together, just to make sure we account for these things correctly, that should always come back to the total cost in that cost pool.
Right.
If it doesn't, then we've kind of missed a portion.
So that's a good way to check, like, for the exam, because we obviously can't check our own work. So that's like just something every time it will equal very close to or that number.
Yes, absolutely. And in the case of the activity rates, generally speaking, those are going to be identical just because those usually kind of round off better than the plant-wide rates.
Right.
But it could be a couple dollars off. But yeah, we always want to make sure that this total between both products or divisions or whatever we're working with comes out pretty darn close within, 1% or whatever of what we have in that actual cost pool.
Okay.
So then we'll do the same thing for the setups and the product sustaining costs here. So the B had 71 setup hours, and that rate was $430 per setup hour. Oops. And then the T had, whoops, stay consistent with my order here, sorry, 230 setup hours times that same rate of $430 per setup hour. And then again, just total them up to make sure we're either close or dead on.
Mm-hmm.
And then product sustaining, I guess we still sort of call that a rate. It's per product, so don't really have to even do any math there. It's just 50,800 to each product.
And the organization sustaining was just one solid line.
Yeah, org sustaining we don't allocate to the individual products, so we'll leave it out of the product margin calculation.
Okay.
Yep. So then our last step here is to come up with a total manufacturing overhead to the product. So that's just the sum of those three individual activities. Just note that that's a total. So 202,000 and change to the B, and then a little more to the T. And then, of course, this is equivalent to the machining plus the setups plus the product sustaining, not including the org sustaining.
Gotcha.
So I'll copy this down just to finish out the idea of the product margin. So again, sales, direct materials, direct labor, that hasn't changed. Now we're saying instead of this overhead here, the B and the T at 367 and 129, we're going to use the 202,830 for the B and the 233,805, excuse me, for the T. So now my product margin, point being for this problem, is considerably different depending on which method I use.
Right.
If I'm using my plant-wide overhead rate, I'm allocating sort of a disproportional amount to the B300, whereas in my activity-based costing, this actually looks like they incur, roughly the same overhead costs.
You look so much better.
I told you I touched on my face.
Okay. That makes sense.
It's probably margins, beyond activity.
Now it seems so much simpler.
And in 3, what we're doing in 3. I want to take a comparison, okay? Yeah, so when we throw these things side by side, right, we had, obviously the materials and labor don't change between the traditional and activity-based costing.
Mhm.
And then as we just illustrated, the overhead costs do change significantly. So in this full comparison, they had you do the individual activities separately,
Mhm.
and then kind of take this to a bottom line of total costs, including some selling and admin and kind of other. But in essence, we sort of hit the big potatoes here.
Gotcha.
Right.
Any other questions here on this particular one or anything that relates to this?
I'm trying to think. For when you're looking at the comparison, should these the two bottom line numbers balance?
Total cost and total cost. So they should be within, a fraction. Yeah, so like this is, what is this, $400 off, or I guess close to $500 off.
Yeah.
But that's because of the rounding with sort of the plant-wide rate here versus the ABC rates that are a little finer.
Mm.
So otherwise, we should be at, at the same numbers here.
So
Okay.
like on the test, should we like freak out if those don't balance? Because that'd be something like I would just stare at that and be like, okay, what numbers did I mess up then?
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. So if you had something like this on the exam and you got to this point, I would say sort of do a quick calculation and see what the difference is if you had one. And if it's within less than 1%, then there's probably nothing to worry about.
Okay. Is there any other questions for chapter 7? Could you just go through the 1 and 2 just so I can see it and be like, oh yeah, I struggled there, because I really don't.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Recall.
You might have struggled there.
Oh, I may have.
So in 1, we had a similar idea, except we were using this notion of a customer margin rather than a product margin.
Mm-hmm.
But kind of at the core, it's the same idea. We're just trying to determine, right, what the potential sort of profitability is of the customer rather than the product. So we did have to account for sales attributable to that customer, direct costs, so direct materials, direct labor, and then all those other indirect costs. So in this case, we took our notion of an ABC system and said, well, now we have 4 activity cost pools: supporting direct labor, batch order, and customer service. And in this case, they gave us those activity rates, and we just applied them to this particular customer.
Right. Yeah, no, I didn't. I thought that was fun.
Yep.
Yeah, so that was the extent there.
I'm trying to think.
And then 2.
2 was kind of the
Mm-hmm.
but with the biggest thing that I think I struggled on there between the hubs and the sprockets, because I got requirement 1 pretty quick as far as how to calculate that activity rate for each one. But then crossing over to requirement 2, it took me a while because we had to do the overhead rate again.
Yeah.
Oh,
But
right.
It was kind of funky because it wasn't necessarily like the traditional activity cost. It was like, I don't know.
I think I know what you mean. So let's run through this actually.
That's a good idea. It's a good plan. I was like, there's definitely another question that I was like, what?
Yeah, because it is a little kind of different what we're trying to get at the end here.
Mm-hmm.
So we did know that we're using ABC again, and we have machine setups, special processing, and then that was it. General factory was the org sustaining. So let's come up with the activity rate first. I know you guys said you're pretty much okay with those, but just to kind of take this end to end. So again, we're going to take the total estimated cost in that cost pool divided by the total activity across all products. So for machine setups, we've got 31,590. And we said that this in total takes 243 setups, including both products. So our rate then is $130, and I always like to write down the units per setup. Special processing, Sprockets didn't use any, but that's fine. We'll still do a rate here. 120,000 in costs in that cost pool, divided by 4,800 machine hours. So that's $25 per machine hour. So let's go ahead then and apply those costs to the hubs and the sprockets. If I can keep enough of this on the screen where we can kind of look at both. Okay. So machine setups, again, we know $130 per setup. And the hub products required 135 setups in this period. Okay, so there's our total activity for the hubs. So that means I'm applying or assigning 17,550 to hubs just for setups. Same deal for sprockets, or same rate I should say, $130 per setup. And the sprockets only took 108 setups here. So 14,040. And one more time, let's just total those up quick. So 31,590, 31,590. Just make sure we've accounted for all the costs. And hubs, let's do this out explicitly again, just to make the point. So the rate's $25 per machine hour, and the hubs used up 4,800 machine hours. So that total cost is $120,000. And then again, just to be explicit, same rate, $25 per machine hour. Sprockets took 0, so no cost there. Okay. So then the total overhead applied or assigned to the hubs is the sum of the amounts applied to the setups or from the setups, and that's special processing. And then same deal for the sprockets. In that case, they only had the setup costs. So now this again represents the total overhead cost applied to these products, but we want it on a per unit basis to determine this unit product cost.
Right.
So what we'll do then, per unit overhead, is take this total cost we've applied, 137,550, and divide by the number of units we produced of the hubs in this particular period. So up at the top here, they told us that was 18,000 units. So again, the 137,550 in total overhead cost for the hub line, if you will, divided by 18,000 units of hubs, means a per unit cost 764 rounded off. And then same idea for the sprockets, 14,040. And they told us the sprockets we made a whole bunch of those, 47,000. So that per unit cost rounded off to 30 cents. So then if we want the unit product cost, Remember, product costs are all of our costs associated really with any part of the production process, whether that's direct or indirect. So we would want our direct materials, our direct labor, and then that manufacturing overhead. So they gave us the materials in part A here. Hubs require 21, sprockets require $11 worth. We did have to do a little bit of math for the direct labor, right? So that says the labor wage rate is $10 per hour, and the hubs take half hour to make each. So in other words, we can make 2 in 1 hour. So that would be, 10 divided by 2 here. And then the sprockets, well, we can make 10 of those in an hour. So a tenth of this $10 rate is $1. And then again, we just came up with our overhead cost here, $7.64 and 30 cents, respectively. So then the total unit cost is just the sum of those 3 components. So $33.64 for hub, $12.30 for the sprocket.
Yeah, so excited. That makes a lot more sense.
Okay, good.
I still got the answer, but it took us a little. Okay.
Okay, so I guess that was it for 2.
For chapter 7, is there anything that you would suggest that we focused on studying?
So I would say that, I always have to officially say that everything's sort of fair game, but I would say that these problems are reflective of what's considered most important in the chapter. So since we really focused on sort of the differences between ABC and traditional costing, I would expect you to be able to come up with activity rates, apply overhead using either system, and then also sort of answer some questions about the differences. And that's where question 3 was kind of helpful in kind of seeing, explicitly well, if I use ABC, I'm probably getting a slightly better picture of what's really driving costs for individual products versus just basing this on some, general driver that really doesn't have a lot to do with the production process.
Gotcha.
So I'd say, if you can sort of work through the numbers of kind of coming up with rates and applying overhead, but then also answering questions about what some of the differences are and what they would mean, you'd probably be pretty well off for chapter 7.
So I have so chapter 4. Let's put my copy in the chapter.
Should I cruise over to chapter 4 here?
Yes, please.
Please.
Trying to remember what we did in the homework problems here.
Me too.
Yes, equivalent units of production. Cost per equivalent unit, et cetera, et cetera. Let's see.
Wasn't too terrible.
The homework wasn't too terrible.
So let's see. Cost per equivalent unit, cost of ending work in process. Okay. Yeah, so can I say in general here? Yeah, so equivalent units of production, very important for lots of things we do in management and cost accounting. So chapter 4 was pretty much our first foray into that. So I would say having a good understanding of what that represents and then sort of how to calculate those things is a good place to start here. So if we think about this in general terms, equivalent units of production is really just telling us the amount of work we've done in the period, right, or the equivalent amount of work we've done. So how many sort of full units would we say we had finished given the amount of work we've completed? And so calculating equivalent units of production, we generally do that with respect to a couple different processes within our overall production process. In this case, it was this pulping process where we had a bunch of materials dumped in and then that conversion. So we often have these completion rates at the end of any period to say, well, if a unit's sitting in work in process in this particular part of the process, it's this amount done, right? It's 80% done, it's 100% done, and so on. So here, just since we're staring at the first part of the problem, we're trying to determine the equivalent units of production for both pulping and conversion for this particular period. So we always start when we're determining equivalent units of production with the units that were finished and transferred out. And the reason we do that, of course, is because if a unit has passed through all the parts of the production process, it must be 100% done with respect to everything, right? So units finished and transferred out, let's see. If they give us those right off the bat. Oh yeah, 163,900. Sometimes we have to calculate that based on what we started with and what we finished with, but here they said, hey, we finished 163,900 units that got passed on down the line out of this department. So to that, we always add the ending work in process, and we generally want to consider our two or more, if we have them, processes separately, because they often have different completion rates, right? So here in particular, we knew that ending work in process was 4,500 physical units. They were all the way done with respect to pulping. They were only 80% done with respect to our conversion processes. So here, kind of do them on separate lines. Pulping, we'd say, well, there's 4,500 physical units. And then just to be explicit again, they're 100% done. So equivalent units would be the same 4,500. For conversion, it's 4,500 physical units, but they're only 80% done at the end of the month. So that's 3,600 equivalent units. So then total equivalent units of production is those units finished and transferred out, plus those ending work in process units, again, factored for that completion rate. And then same thing for conversion. So again, this measure tells us, well, I did the equivalent of 168,400 units with respect to pulping, and I did the equivalent of 167,500 with respect to conversion. And that difference, again, comes because those ending work in process units aren't all the way done with respect to conversion.
Right.
Yeah, that probably doesn't.
Okay. And then cost per unit in the second part, we're always basing those calculations on equivalent units, not physical units. And that can sort of trip us up sometimes. So even if it doesn't explicitly say so, anytime you're looking for cost per equivalent unit, you want to make sure that you're finding this total equivalent units of production before you start to determine those dollars. Otherwise, you're basing it on physical units, which is not the same. So problem one, we really took that whole idea start to finish. I don't know if there's anything specific from these you guys remember kind of.
No, not yet.
Okay. Cost of units transferred. Oh, cost reconciliation. We didn't talk about that. So our little cost reconciliation reports we do at the end of every period, really just trying to make sure that our total costs to be accounted for, so all the costs we've dumped into the process, that we can show where those costs went or where they still are.
Gotcha.
right? So total cost to be accounted for, that top line is always this total amount that we've added to the process.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, in that bottom section, we're going to say, well, where the heck did those dollars go, right? Or the goods associated with those dollars, where'd they go? And generally, that means we're going to have some kind of cost of units completed and transferred, things that have left this department or our company in general, if we're doing this at a higher level.
Right.
And then what's the cost associated with stuff that's sitting in ending work in process, stuff that's not quite done yet, and it's going to become part of those costs for next period.
Okay.
Is it maybe 3?
Sorry?
Can you check question 3?
Oh, sure. Oh, journal entries. Yeah, these were nice.
Oh, those
weren't too bad.
We like those.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
When we first got into managerial accounting, we were like, when are we going to be able to do some journal entries?
Oh my gosh. That's literally all
because
120 was.
Yeah, like our teacher in 120, she drilled those into us. And
so we don't get to do many in this class, but here was a good opportunity.
Just give us journal entries.
The thing I like about them in this context is they really help us see the flow of costs, like where the heck things are going.
Right.
So when we're requisitioning materials for use, it's kind of nice to see, oh yeah, I'm taking them out of raw materials, I'm pushing them into work in process in my departments, and so on. So I really kind of wish we sort of did more of them related to that, just to help us see that flow.
Yeah.
But just having a few is better than none, I guess.
And this is basically just showing the process of if you're closing from one department to the next, and then that department is finished, and now this is all of your finished goods. This is what this is, right?
Right. So F here, I'm saying, blending was the last stop in the production process. I'm saying, I'm not working on these anymore. Now they're ready to sell. So I can increase that finished goods amount and take those costs out of my production process really entirely.
Right. Sweet.
And then part 2, I guess then we just post them to TA.
Yeah, just take it.
Which is...
something that has happened in the last couple ones of our homework for T accounts. If you go to the T accounts, on several of the accounts themselves, in the homeworks, it wants you to put zeros at the top of both of them. Sometimes.
All of them, sometimes.
And it doesn't quite make sense to us because even if there's nothing in the, like, there was one time, there was some account, there were no like actual accounts that we had posted to it. It was just a blank account. And it still wanted
zero balances.
So zero in beginning and ending, or just an ending?
No, like
at the top
on the debit and the credit side.
Yes.
That's really weird.
Yeah. Even like if one, like no matter what the normal balance of the account was, it still wanted the zeros in both. So would we get points off like on the test for that? Like
not at all. And in fact, I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm gonna put a note to the Connect support thing for that. I don't know if, I know they won't change it immediately for us, but that just, it doesn't make any sense.
Right, it threw us off. We were like,
it's not.
There was some of them where we actually did miss because like,
it was literally like a point.
Like the raw materials, the work in progress, and the finished goods at the top, it gives you the beginning balance of those accounts. And so we were like, but we didn't get those during the journal entry, so where did that come from? And then we were like, it gave it to us. So,
right. Yeah, they should. I don't know why they don't fill in the ones that are given, but that's a secret.
So we're sitting here banging our heads going, what are we missing?
That's really, it shouldn't do that either.
Okay, so I feel more confident about chapter 4 than 7, but I'm glad we went over 7 because that really helped me like see visually, like this is, you need to break it down, but you need to start with your activity rate and then work from there.
Okay, good.
That was definitely helpful. Do you have any more specific questions?
Can we go back to number 1 on 4 real quick? There was requirement 4 or 5 was the one I spent the most time on.
Okay. So let's see. 1 we said was, we just did 1, I guess. 2, cost per equivalent unit.
Yeah.
So once we had the total equivalent units, we can, just to kind of make sure we're on the right page here. So we had costs associated with pulping for this period of 95,857. And then we had 168,400 units. Whoops. Need more decimals. So that's 57 cents per equivalent unit. I guess they have a slightly different rounding. And then conversion, we had 69,096. So total cost, again, added during March, divided by those total equivalent units.
Mm-hmm.
Pushing out my decimals again. I'm at 41 rounded off. I don't know why they're rounding a penny different. Yeah, but bottom line, take my total cost added here, divided by those equivalent units, and there we are. And then 3, cost of ending work in process for pulping conversion and in total. So cost of ending WIP. Well, we know our cost per equivalent unit,
Mm-hmm.
and we know our equivalent units in ending work in process. So if I multiply those two, that should give me the cost of ending work in process. So for pulping, it's the 57 cents per equivalent unit
Mm-hmm.
times those 4,500 equivalent units I had.
Right.
And then similar deal for conversion, the cost per equivalent unit times equivalent units. And there's my cost of ending WIP. Oh, and then total, I guess they wanted, so I can just sum those up.
What part was that?
That was part 3.
3.
Yep.
And then 4 said, compute the cost of units transferred out to finishing for pulping conversion and in total. Oh, okay, yeah. So cost of units transferred. So again, everything's driven off sort of, for better or worse maybe, having that cost per equivalent unit, right?
Literally the first one.
Yeah, so unfortunately,
The first one.
unfortunately, you kind of could snowball a little bit if you got in trouble there. Because cost of units transferred, again, we're saying, well, I transferred out 162,900.
Right.
I already know my cost per equivalent unit from part 1.
Mm-hmm.
So I just multiply the 2. And we've got some different rounding than them here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But same idea for conversion. Oops. 41, and theirs was a different penny, so penny difference. And then, yeah, cost, oh.
And then number 5 was the cost record.
Oh, then cost reconciliation, right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oops. So yeah, cost to be accounted for. If we have any cost of beginning work in process, we'll see that there. Then at the very least, everything we've dumped into the process this period, that's our to be accounted for amounts. And then stuff we accounted for on the way out, either our, both of our cost of ending work in process. We had some slightly different rounding than them. And then the cost of those units completed and transferred, which for them rounds off to, to the 16339. For us, it was a few bucks less. But
Sweet.
I think, I guess that was it for 1.
So this is just strictly chapter 4, chapter 7.
Yes. I mean, I would say, just to kind of be fair, some of the concepts are repeated from early chapters, but they've been used in these problems. So like the idea of a product cost, for example, and what that entails, that's not specific to chapter 4 or 7, but it's been used in 4 and 7.
Right.
So I would not spend time going back to look at the early chapters, unless you run into a question where you're like, oh, I'm not really sure what's included as a product cost or something like that. Otherwise, definitely just hammer the 4 and 7 stuff. Excuse me, gosh.
Hammer it out.
Think about it. Okay, I'm so thankful for this. Thank you for Skyping with us.
Oh, no problem.
Going over it. Do other kids in the class use this?
It really varies by semester. Some semesters I have like high demand for it, and I try to schedule like big group ones. Mm-hmm. And then other semesters, like I don't really hear from anyone for weeks at a time. And
I could not.
It really just depends. It's kind of strange.
Yeah, that is weird.
But like for us, like the weirdest thing about going from a classroom setting to this was in our 120 accounting class, we were actually in a computer lab.
Yeah.
Which had never been done in our school. So we had these computers sitting right in front of us. So moving to this, the format was kind of similar.
Same. Yeah, like
but not having the teacher in front of us kind of like threw us off a little bit. Because we're used to doing Learn Smarts. We're used to doing
Connect.
Mm-hmm.
All of that good.
Mm-hmm.
And so like the biggest issue was trying to figure out some of these formulas.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, okay.
In the sense of, okay, like we can go through and we can read it, but what does that look like practically for the homework?
Right. Yep. Understand.
Yeah. No, I mean, it probably wasn't the best idea to take this class online. But I think it's okay. It is definitely a learning curve. Because we don't have someone that's like right there telling us, nope, try again.
Right. Yeah, no, I understand.
Check my work is my teacher. Like, that's what we use. So
now, have you guys, mostly out of curiosity, have you guys used some of the like practice foundational and
yes,
okay,
like the guided examples and everything?
Yeah.
Like yes.
Some people find them more helpful than others, so I'm always just curious if individual people are finding them useful.
Keep including them. And the videos that you include, I look at those just to like literally hear you say, okay, this is how I started this problem and this is how I'm working through it.
Oh, okay.
If we don't know, like, where do I even start? Like, it's helpful to have that little video at the bottom.
Yeah, okay, good.
When it's 10 o'clock and we're trying to get our homework done.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I'm always trying to sort of add those as I can and figure out the best places to put them in, but
For sure.
But yeah, the guided example is definitely like a huge help.
Okay, good.
Even if nothing else, it gives you a little bit of a practice, and then that little video that you tag in there for like the hint kind of explains like the breakdown of the process and how we're getting to the numbers.
Okay.
So that really, for me, because I'm a very visual learner in the sense of I need to know like what the formula does and how it interacts with specific things. So if it's work in process, I need to know what numbers I'm plugging in for work in process to start with, and then how to, whatever formula it is to get to the end. So that helps me. That it really worked for me, at least.
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah.
Hopefully we do better on this exam.
Oh yeah.
Oh, last exam killed us. But
you guys will be fine, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think definitely reviewing it will help, and it's pretty fresh. So.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's due what, Sunday?
Yeah.
Yep. I say we do it Friday. That'll be fun. That'll be a fun time for me to. Yeah. Well. So. Thank you, sir.
Very welcome. Yeah, I mean, if you have questions before you get ready to take it, always feel free to ask. And
I will.
Okay.
I will be scouring the all the practices and everything else, looking for questions for you.
Okay. Oh, do you guys want me to? Let's see. This has been recording. Do you want me to post this and send you a link to it in case you want to look back at it?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Cool. I will do that.
Good stuff. Okay.
All right. Well, if you didn't have any other questions for the time being, then I'll let you go. And again, just email or whatever you need.
Okay. No, I think that was all the questions we had.
Yes.
Okay.
But we'll definitely be in contact with you if
all right. Well, take care for now then, guys.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Shoot.